Good evening. Today, my presentation will be on the topic of pragmatic differences between an Italian L1 and Italian L2 speakers, focusing specifically on apologies. So my research concerns Australian learners of Italian in university settings in Australia. And I also look at these learners and their language use in a comparison with native speakers of Australian English and native speakers of Italian. And I'll be sharing some of this research today. So to give an overview of my presentation this evening, first and foremost, I'll be giving an overview of the research, followed by an overview of the methodology used. I'll then be looking at explicit apologies across the three participant groups I mentioned, so the learners of Italian, the Australian English native speakers, and the native speakers of Italian. Then looking briefly at the modification of some of these explicit apologies, before then discussing some conclusions and implications of the research. So first and foremost, my research concerns apologies. So these are often remedial actions. They restore harmony between interlocutors, generally when somebody has done something which is perceived to violate a social norm or disrupt the harmony of an interaction. In the context in which I am looking at apologies, emails written by Australian learners of Italian to professors and to tutors. So looking at that student to academic staff in communication in a university setting, and specifically looking at apologies within those emails. And as I mentioned, again, looking at this in a comparative perspective with native speakers of Italian and native speakers of Australian English to see where these learners lie between those two native speaker groups. To do this, I have a mixed methodology. So 4 principal methods looking at elicited emails by the learners and the 2 native speaker groups. So this is through an elicitation task. I then have follow-up interviews with the learners of Italian to discuss what they did in the elicited emails and to get a bit more of an understanding of why they made the choices that they did. I then have an appropriateness evaluation completed by academics of Italian studies to get the academic perspective or the recipient perspective of these emails. And then finally, authentic emails. And I've used these to compare to the elicited emails to see whether what's happening within the elicitation task actually does reflect what happens in real life, as it were. So today in this presentation, I will be looking at 3 of these methodologies and 3 of these specific types of data. So elicited emails, interviews, and authentic emails as well. So the elicited emails were collected from each of the 3 participant groups. Overall, 49 learners of Italian from intermediate and advanced levels participated. 53 native speakers of Italian and 20 native speakers of Australian English also participated in this data collection. So participants were presented with a written task, which involved 6 prompts to which they were asked to respond in the form of an email. So an example of this includes this here: your final essay was due last night. However, you did not finish on time. Write an email to your professor. So there was a very brief description of what the task was, what the situation was, and then a prompt to write to a specific individual, whether this be a professor or a tutor. In terms of the post-task interviews, 9 of the learners of Italian who participated in that writing task also agreed to participate in the post-task interview, so a follow-up interview. These interviews were semi-structured. There were a series of topics which I covered, so looking at what is involved in an apology, looking at perspectives of tutors versus professors in the academic context, and looking at some of the specific things which the learners had done within their elicited email task. But the semi-structured format gave a bit more flexibility, a bit more comfort to the learners as well. I really wanted this to be a comfortable conversational space. Finally, the authentic emails were collected from learners of Italian. again at intermediate and advanced levels, and these were emails which students had sent to academic staff of Italian studies. So I don't have any details of the demographic profiles of these learners of Italian due to the nature of the ethical approval and the very strict privacy around authentic email collection at my university. But I do know that these are learners of Italian who are a comparable group to those who participated in the elicited task. And interestingly enough, 10 of these emails were written in Italian, 31 were written in English, and 3 were written in a mix of Italian and English. And that will come into play a bit later on. But overall, 44 elicited emails, as well as all of the, 44 authentic emails, as well as all of the elicited emails. In terms of how apologies were performed in the emails, both elicited and authentic, there were 3 principal apology strategies which I identified in my data. So first and foremost, the explicit expression of apology, which is what we generally would identify as an apology. So the I'm sorry, I apologize, please forgive me phrases. Accounting for what happened was the second strategy. This is where participants attempted to give some form of reasoning for what had occurred. And then remedial action was an attempt to fix the situation, to provide some form of solution or seek some form of solution. So these arose from the data, but also drew upon previous literature within the field. And today we are focusing on one of those in particular, the explicit expression of apology. So explicit apologies were made explicit by the fact that they included an illocutionary force indicating device, which I will be referring to as an IFID throughout this presentation. So these are formulaic, routine expressions which we would commonly identify as carrying that apology. So as I said before, to apologize, to be sorry are prime examples. Examples from the data. So my sincerest apologies in English. Le chiediamo scusa, we apologize, we ask forgiveness. In Italian, perdonarmi, forgive me. And scusandomi, apologizing. So overall, across the 3 participant groups, there were 23 individual IFIDs, which I identified. 20 of these were in Italian, 3 of these were in English. So yes, there were fewer emails collected in English. There were only 20 participants in the Australian English group and much more in the learner and the native Italian speaker group. But at the same time, I don't believe that that's why there is this differentiation in the numbers. It has been noted in the literature again and again that Italian does have a wider range of explicit apology expressions than the English language does. So this differentiation really seems to be reflective of those linguistic differences rather than numbers of participants or size of corpus. So when we look at what these IFIDs actually were in the English and Italian corpuses, so the 3 in English were sorry, apologize, and apologies. And then there were much more in that Italian group. So we're not going to go through all of them in detail, and indeed some of them were only used a couple of times. But there are 2 principal IFIDs that I really want to focus on here in Italian. So the first of these is scusarsi. It's the canonical prototypical apology in Italian, which again has been proven through previous literature that this is the main apology phrase, the main IFID in Italian. And usually this is identified as a request for forgiveness. So there's this implication of you've done something wrong, you're admitting that you've done something wrong, you're asking for somebody to forgive you. In contrast, dispiacersi, it's a conventional expression of regret. So it doesn't necessarily carry that implication of wanting somebody to forgive or necessarily carry that implication of having admitted to having done something wrong. So in English, we might say that scusarsi is very similar to apologize, which has that extra weight attached to it, whereas dispiacersi would be very similar to sorry, where you're expressing regret for something, but not necessarily implying that you yourself have caused that thing or done something wrong. So when we look at the native speakers of Italian, overwhelmingly, scusarsi becomes or is the most common IFID. It really pops out as the IFID which these native speakers of Italian are relying on. Everything else is used quite infrequently compared to scusarsi. I should note as well, the other section here is every other IFID which was used. So anything under 5% is included in that other there. But I do really want to focus again on that scusarsi. Over 70% of the IFIDs performed by native speakers of Italian were scusarsi, some conjugation of scusarsi. When we look at the learners of Italian, it becomes a very different story. So just over 70% of the learners of Italian's IFIDs were dispiacersi. Scusarsi is used in just under 15% of cases. So really here we see something quite different, a real reliance on dispiacersi as opposed to scusarsi. So there's a real contrast between these two groups here. And then when we look at the native speakers of Australian English, we might see why there might be this reliance on dispiacersi in the learners of Italian. So remembering that dispiacersi is that expression of regret and scusarsi is more of, carries a bit more weight, more of an asking for forgiveness. So here, sorry, the classic expression of regret in Australian English is really the most common IFID used by the native speakers of Australian English, whereas apologise and apologies are less frequent. So when we compare the learners to the native speakers of Australian English, here they are both relying heavily on that expression of regret, the dispiacersi or this sorry. So it might be here that the expression of regret being quite common in Australian English means that the learners have been more likely to use that expression of regret or its equivalent when speaking or writing rather in Italian. So there seems to be some crossing over of knowledge of Australian English and how to apologise in Australian English to the learner's use of Italian. Though I do think that there are some other reasons for this, which I will get to in a moment. But just to really hammer home that point of sorry being the classic apology in English, not only is it prevalent within the literature, but also when we look at the student perspective through the post-task interviews, when I posed the question, what is necessary in an apology? A lot of the learners did identify sorry or some conjugation of to be sorry as necessary in apologies. So we have, well, definitely, simply I'm sorry, just sorry. I think that's the most obvious and straightforward one. Sorry has got to be in there to say sorry. There definitely needs to be an I'm sorry. So not only has sorry been explicitly noted by each of these participants, but there's also quite high modality being used here. So definitely needs to be, got to be. And Annalise says that it's the most obvious and straightforward one. So definitely sorry arising as the apology phrase, the IFID, which these learners are thinking of first and foremost. So I do believe that this has an influence on the learners of Italian and why they are using dispiacersi, with the expression of regrets in Italian. Though by the same token, I don't believe that the learners or any other language speakers would necessarily think, oh, an expression of regret is the most common in my language, and so I must use it in my L2. I think there are other things at play. One of these things is that when we conjugate sorry in English, it's usually in the form of I'm sorry. And the most common form of dispiacersi in Italian conjugated is mi dispiace. So while these are slightly different grammatically, there does seem to be some alignment here, at least on face value, in terms of how these two apologies, these two IFIDs are structured. So we have the I'm sorry and the mi dispiace. So really we've got that kind of pronoun at the beginning and then the apology phrase or apology word, the sorry and dispiace. So there does seem to be a bit of alignment here, and we could see how learners might clock on to I'm sorry and mi dispiace being equivalents of each other, and how mi dispiace might be very easy to remember when the most common apology in English is I'm sorry. And then there's also the element of scusarsi can be conjugated in many, many different ways. So it changes in relation to formality, it changes in relation to who you're speaking to. There are a lot more ways that you can use scusarsi than you can use dispiacersi. So scusarsi requires a bit more thought, a bit more consideration, let's say, than dispiacersi. So dispiacersi is also a more simple apology phrase for learners. And I think these are key reasons why there tends to be that emphasis on dispiacersi in the learners rather than scusarsi, which is more typical of native Italian speech. When we look at efforts performed by the learners of Italian background and non-Italian background, dispiacersi in both these groups is overwhelmingly the favored IFID. So definitely there across the board, dispiacersi seems to be predominantly the way to go in terms of IFID choice for the learners of Italian. Though I think it is interesting to look at what happens when the learners don't use dispiacersi. So we see the non-Italian background and the Italian background learners do use other IFIDs quite differently. So the learners of Italian background use chiedere scusa much more frequently than the learners of non-Italian background. They also use spiacente, which the learners of non-Italian background haven't used. So when the learners of Italian background don't use dispiacersi, there seems to be a bit more range in their IFID choice. And this is possibly because they may have been exposed to a different number of IFIDs or a wider range of IFIDs than those of non-Italian background. And we see here in this quote from Joseph in the post-task interviews that for his case, at least, that family background and that knowledge of Italian carried over from the family context does have an influence in how he apologizes. So he says, I've never used mi dispiace. It's just always been scusa. That's just how I was raised. That's just what my mum and my grandparents use when they talk Italian. So there we definitely see that influence of family Italian use on how Joseph apologizes in Italian. Turning to the authentic emails now, what arises here is quite interesting. So yes, there's a mix of Italian and English IFIDs here, remembering that some of the authentic emails were written in English, some of them were written in Italian, some of them were written in a mix of Italian and English. So we do have a bit of a mix here. But when we look at sorry, it's used in just under 60% of cases, just over 15% of cases are dispiacersi. Scusarsi is used very little in the authentic emails, as is apologize and apologies, and then the other types of Italian IFIDs. So really when we look at sorry and combine it with dispiacersi, so when we're looking at the two expressions of regret together, we have around 75% of IFIDs in the authentic emails being those expressions of regret, which really does align with the percentages which we saw for dispiacersi and sorry singularly when we looked at the learners of Italian writing in Italian and the native speakers of Australian English writing in English. So this seems to very much back up what we saw in the elicited emails. Just quickly turning to intensification and reiterators in IFID. So these are ways of modifying the IFID. So intensifiers, ways of strengthening the force of an explicit apology, whereas reiterators make clear that that explicit apology, that IFID is being repeated. So this is particularly the case in emails which included multiple IFIDs. So some emails could include up to 5 IFIDs throughout the email. So these reiterators were used in those cases. In terms of what they look like, we have mi dispiace tanto, I'm very sorry, I'm extremely sorry, siamo molto dispiaciute, we are very sorry, scusa ancora, sorry again, again I apologize, and scusa di nuovo, sorry once more. So when we look here at the percentage of IFIDs including modification, the learners of Italian show alignment to the native speakers of Italian, in that around 30% of the IFIDs performed include modification. And the Australian English native speakers use modification in just over half the IFIDs performed. So the inclusion of modification seems to be much more prevalent in Australian English than in Italian. And this is also backed up by the authentic emails. So there's an alignment here with the learners in that there isn't much modification used. When we look at the types of modifiers used across the three groups, so the Australian English native speakers and the learners of Italian predominantly favour intensifiers. So very much an emphasis here on strengthening that apology rather than reiterating the apology. And that's not the case in the native Italian speaker data. When we look at the authentic emails, this aligns with the learners of Italian and the Australian English native speakers, so that emphasis on intensifying as opposed to reiterators. So we see here that the learners of Italian, when they do use modification, both in their authentic emails and the elicited emails, they really do align with the Australian English native speakers. So that's quite interesting there. So overall, we see that there is a greater range of IFIDs in the Italian language. There's a far greater variety of IFIDs in Italian than there is in English, though there's a greater modification of IFIDs in Australian English. So we might say that Australian English, for perhaps a lack of IFIDs as opposed to Italian, there's a wider modification of these IFIDs. So the diversity in Australian apologies comes from that modification of IFIDs rather than a set number of IFIDs, perhaps. And we do see L1 influence in the learner's performance of IFIDs, principally through IFID choice, so that reliance on dispiacersi on the part of the learners, rather than scusarsi, which is that canonical Italian apology, and that reliance on dispiacersi really aligning with the emphasis on the expression of regret in Australian English, I'm sorry. And then in terms of the modification of IFIDs, we see that when the learners do use modifiers, they do it in a way which aligns with the English speakers rather than the Italian native speakers. So this does have implications for cross-cultural and intercultural communication. We have here two groups, the native speakers and the non-native speakers, the learners, using the same language in very different ways. And so there's that possibility of native speakers and learners coming to an interaction and using that language quite differently, and particularly when you're talking about apologies, which are acts which repair relationships and mediate conflict within scenarios. It's important to consider this possibility that native speakers and learners of the language might be using these apologies in different ways. And this also has pedagogical implications. So really, I suppose we could ask, should language teaching focus on languages used by L1 speakers? And then if we do that, if we say, yes, we should teach the learners to speak as native speakers, how do we do this in a second language context or a foreign language context? So one of the other things which came through the data was the fact that the Australian language classroom is very different from a language classroom in Italy, and that has follow-on effects in regards to how a language is used in the classroom. So I don't necessarily have the answers, but it's an important point to consider, and definitely something to ponder, and I'm more than happy to hear your thoughts on the issue. So thank you very much for tuning into the presentation, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks.